Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. We're very pleased to have you at another session of DiscoverEE. My name is Alison Mostowich, and I am the Director of Engagement at Efficiency Canada. I am joining you from Calgary, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation, specifically Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Before we get started, just a quick reminder to everyone that our guest speakers will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions after that. So if you have a question that pops up for you during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And this is a really cool feature of Zoom. If there's a question that somebody else asks, you can actually upvote it. So we're making sure they ask the questions that are of most priority to you. We do have a hard stop at 12:45 Eastern time, respecting everybody's busy days and other important meetings like getting some lunch today. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome our guests today. We have Olivier Cappon, Senior Director of Business Development and Government Relations for the Canadian Institute of Energy Training. And we have Geneviève Gauthier, who works in energy transition and carbon neutrality with Econoler. I am very much looking forward to learning about some great kickoff points for carbon neutral strategies in businesses across Canada. So please welcome me in joining Olivier and Geneviève.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. So everyone, it's great to be with you again. I think this is the fourth time that I've gotten to participate in one of the DiscoverEE sessions. So thanks very much for having me again. What we're going to do today mostly is we'd like to try and sort of demystify a lot of the aspects around carbon neutrality, and then maybe one or two around net zero, especially how one compares to the other. Of course, we only have a set amount of time, but what we're going to do is we're just going to set the table first and go over the meaning behind this, why it's important, why it's relevant now, and also why it's growing in relevance and becoming more and more prominent on the agenda of organizations. So we'll have Geneviève give us about a 5 or 10 minute introduction around that, and then I've got some what I think are poignant questions for Geneviève that we'll bat around, and we'll get her take on a few topical questions that we have here, and then of course we'll open it up to all of you. So please do save your questions, as we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes of time for questions towards the end. So that's how we'll host this session. So we'll get started. First, Geneviève, I should say that I've selected 5 or 6 slides for you to go over just quickly, just to set the context, starting with, of course, what are international commitments that were established in 2015 and what this means specifically for Canada.
Okay, thank you, Olivier. And for those who may not know, those slides are easily extracted slides from a deck we have, which is basically the deck that SIET has for its carbon neutrality training that I've been delivering for the past year or so, and so you can check out on their website to see. And there's so much to tell about carbon neutrality that, of course, is going to be very, very very small information about it. You can read what's on the side, but basically, why is it relevant now? And you heard and you hear in the news, when you at the radio, newspaper, and so on, at the news, that there are commitments. There used to be commitments by the international committee, specifically the United Nations and so on, and the federal government, provincial government. I'm sure you heard about like this, that everybody is trying to limit the climate change to an increase of 2 degrees Celsius worldwide, and we should even to limit the impact on the environment and our quality of life to 1.5 Celsius. This is probably a number you've heard. It used to be only environmentalists and a high-level government that were used to set commitment and targets, and honestly not really meeting the targets or reaching their goals. But in the past 2 years or so, those commitments have become more and more serious, meaning that there are plans right now, and in some organizations, some governments, it's embedded in the law that they need to reach their specific GHG reduction commitment. And the one thing I find the most interesting is the private organizations. So for the past 2 years or so, you see more and more private organizations, the real estate sector, in the industrial sector, and all sectors, really, like small and very large companies that are giving themselves targets that they want to bid by. And most of the targets, which is kind of new for the past 2 years, are not about reducing GHG emission. It's not even just also reduced by 20% or 30% like you see in the slide, but a lot of the companies also, right now, even in the private sector, are pledging to reach carbon neutrality by 2030 or 2040 and 2050. And the reason is that because we took so long to start decreasing our GHG emissions, that now it's getting more, I wouldn't say too late, it's getting later and later to reach our target. So the more we wait to reduce GHG emissions, the more drastic we'll have to be about our reduction. So we hear more than just reducing 30 to 40%, but really things about reaching carbon neutrality and even carbon negativity. So it's something that's not only the government objective right now, but a lot of private organization objective as well. And you can switch slide if you want, Olivier. So I've basically said why we hear now carbon neutrality more and more, but I think that in the next year or 2 or 3 years, but anyway, in the near future, we'll hear more about carbon negativity. And if you want to know more about that, you can look at the IPCC report. But the reason is that, like I said, because we've waited so long to reduce our GHG emissions, that now when we look at the GHG balance around the Earth, let's put it that way, that in order to reach our target, we'll have to not only stop emitting GHG emissions in the atmosphere, but start to actually capture and store. I'm not necessarily talking about CCS like in the ground, but it could be by trees or anything like that. But the more we have, because we've waited so long, now we've reached a point that we have to pledge or set our targets that will be carbon negative. And there's, I'm not sure what's the next slide, Olivier, but there's standards that exist that help organizations setting target, and the one that's becoming more and more popular, that's probably going to be the global dominating standard, is the Science-Based Target Initiative standard, that it's based on science, that helps organizations understand their GHG emissions compared to their peers in the sector, and that compare their sectors to others, so you can really come up with a target that will help the climate, but with science methodology. And that standard has changed last fall. It used to be all to set up your target so that your target respects science, but it's changed last fall and has become now a carbon neutral standard. So it's becoming more and more important. And the companies, why our companies want to become a carbon neutral? Because the government right now sometimes, and we've seen that during COVID, they had stimulus, economic stimulus that was for COVID, that has nothing to do with climate change, but that was asking, for instance, that our organization provide a carbon neutrality strategy in order to get the stimulus package. We see more and more like large companies like Amazon or other global players that are asking the suppliers also to become carbon neutral. I'm not sure if your organization, you have some issues in recruiting employees, but more and more the new staff, the younger generation, is asking for all type of companies to have like carbon reduction targets, the clients and so on. So the entire ecosystem is asking for it, and that's why it has become important and crucial for all our organizations, whether they are in the industrial sector and the real estate sector. What you see on the slide, I'm assuming that most of you are somehow familiar with scope 1, 2, and 3, but just in a nutshell, those are how we label the different GHG emissions in our organization. So really quickly, the scope 1 is basically what's burned on site. So whether it's natural gas that fuels the boiler that heats the building, whether it's the vehicle fleet, the fleet of the organization for that, for example, an electrician used to provide services to its client. So it's really like direct emissions that are by the organization. Mostly it's like fossil fuels for buildings and cars or fleet of truck and so on, that is under the full control of the organization. The scope 2 emission is a direct emission that's linked to the energy that's purchased from a third party. So it could be from the electricity you buy from the grid. If the electricity is not coming from renewable energy and that some fossil fuel is used to produce electricity, so it means that every kilowatt you consume is emitting GHG emissions not on site but at your supplier's site. So that will be scope 2 emission. Most of the time it's linked to the electricity we consume, but it could be also steam if you purchase steam from a district system. So it's really related to the energy you consume. So you have a control over, obviously, your energy consumption. You have less of a control about how this energy is produced. So that's why it's called scope 2. So most of the organizations right now that want to reduce their GHG emissions or achieve carbon neutrality will set the target for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, because those are the ones that are under control. It means that if you can invest, you can do behavioral change, you can change things in your organization that will help you reduce or eliminate scope 1 and scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions is just it's becoming more and more important, is the emissions that's related to everything that's not under your direct control. It could be how your employee commute to work. It could be your suppliers' GHG emissions. It covers all the GHG emissions from upstream to downstream. If you're a manufacturer, for instance, it will cover from the raw material extraction and processing and so on. Ship the material to your facility, you transform it, it's scope 1 and scope 2. You sell it, and the product needs to be disposed by, for instance, the end users. So that will also be scope 3. And we haven't heard a lot about scope 3 emissions in the past years, like more than 5 years ago, but it's becoming more and more important, because now you see large organizations that are asking their suppliers to reduce their GHG emissions because they want to reduce their scope 3 emissions. So more and more we see organizations that have objectives to reduce also their scope 3 emissions. So that will percolate to the entire ecosystem real soon. You can switch slide, Olivier. That goes very fast.
Yeah, and for this one, Geneviève, I just thought it'd be interesting to, obviously we can't cover all the strategies, but some of the strategies that organizations, in a nutshell, can start to think about as they chart their path towards carbon neutrality.
Okay, so yeah, there's basically 4 steps. Of course, it starts with an inventory. There are ways of doing inventory. There are standards and protocols. So that's beyond the objective of that webinar. But you start, obviously, like in energy, you start by measuring what you have, set boundaries, and then set objective. But Olivier wants me to focus on characterizing the potential. So I would say that in our work at Econoler, when we've worked on a strategy with carbon neutrality strategies for clients that had portfolio of assets all across Canada, there are basically a few pillars we come with that are some levels that you can use to reach carbon neutrality. So just on the top of my head, like asset management, for instance, when you build a new building, you try to build it net zero from the beginning, not build it with using the standard codes and then retrofit it. So it's really about how you use your current building. It's everything to do, like I already have investment plan. Why don't I add a little bit more capital to have so that it becomes like energy efficient and carbon neutral. So asset management, energy management, which is more or less ISO 50001 standard, whether the organization wants to apply for the standard or not. So it's really to measure, manage, follow your energy and GHG consumption, and try to go after all those low cost, no cost measures to decrease the energy and GHG emissions. Then, of course, energy efficiency, right? So to try to be efficient the way you use energy. So all those 3 pillars, our experience show that you can actually reduce carbon in your organization from 40 to 40%, and in an economic way, in an economically, financially viable way. So it means that the carbon abatement costs, it means you're getting wealthier by reducing carbon. After comes other types of measures like installing renewable energy on site. Then comes after like purchasing green electricity, purchasing renewable natural gas, and then carbon offset. So there are different strategies, different pillars that needs to be taken into account with design strategy. And of course, the first steps are, like I said, financially viable. But as the more and more you reduce your GHG emissions, of course, the more and more it's going to cost you. And just I'll throw a number before we change slide, Olivier, but in the work we've done in the building sector for the portfolio of buildings all across Canada, we came with the abatement cost of around like $200 to $300 per ton of GHG to completely reduce the carbon in the organization. So it's not cheap, but it's not that expensive. And those numbers were for organizations that wanted to reach carbon neutrality, so be very aggressive about their GHG reduction. Well, that's basically like just a slide that is another way of saying the different steps in reaching carbon neutrality. So first, every organization that wants to reduce their GHG emissions, they have to first do the inventory of scope 1, scope 2, and 3, but also set the boundary of what they're doing. For instance, we're working with the port, And most of their GHG emissions is Scope 3 emissions, because their own activities, the one that they have the full control on, is very limited compared to all the ships that come and use the port and so on and so forth. So the first important step is really to set the boundary and then do the Scope 1, Scope 3 inventory, and then set the objective and work on a strategy. It goes too fast, Olivier. You can switch slide.
Well, you know, now I think, Geneviève, I should allow you to take a breath, and I think we'll switch over to the interview portion of what we planned for today. So, you know, I was going to start with the question, Geneviève, of what you think accounts for the growing interest in carbon neutrality, but I think really you already answered that question. So actually, a lot of individuals think that when they look at carbon neutrality and what goes on into it, a lot of people think that they make two assumptions, I think. That one, it's easier for a smaller organization than a large one. Maybe you can demystify that. And the other thing that a lot of people assume is that, of course, it's easier for organizations that have a lot of capital to get to carbon neutrality because they can essentially use carbon offsets to get there. So do you want to sort of comment on those two and demystify those 2 points?
Yes, it's a very sophisticated question with a lot of details. The first part of the question was, is it easier for larger organization rather than small organization?
Is
right?
it easier for one size organization versus another to tackle carbon neutrality?
I wouldn't say so. I would say that the challenges are different. So for small organizations, what the challenge is having the skilled people to do it. So most of the time, small organizations are limited in staff. A particular employee will do different things, and one of the things might be to try to reduce carbon. So then they will have to rely a lot of outside contractors to help them out. And most of that smaller organization, for instance, will be in the manufacturing sector, or they will be in the real estate, and they have a lot of Scope 3. So it's not very, the challenge will be, it's easier in terms of there's less to do, maybe. It's easier to have a control on because the organization is simpler. It's not as complex. Most of the time, they can take their own decision, as opposed to they have to rely on a headquarters as in Germany or United States and so on and so forth. So their level of action is actually higher, but then they don't have a specific team dedicated to that. So that would be their challenge. On the other hand, the larger organization, sometimes the decision process making is a lot more complicated. If they are asking for capital, they might have access to it within their organization, but then the decision is taken outside of their own specific unit. It's taken at the headquarters. So that part might be a little bit more difficult, but they have more access to capital, and they can have dedicated team to it. But one of the things that has changed in the past is that now for organizations that are looking at financing that, right? It used to be, well, I have capital, which is basically mean that I have like cash in my bank account, right? That I can spend. It used to be, if I don't, I can't do it. I will rely on an incentive, and that's pretty much it. If I don't know, I don't want to go to the bank and have a debt to increase in that, to invest in becoming carbon neutral, because I want to use that credit line to install a new manufacturing line, or have my retrofit my building so that it's more attractive to tenants and so on. So the one thing that has changed in the past few years, that there are a few innovative energy efficiency finance options that are available. One of them is the one that Econoler was part of in designing it with Sofiac. So what Sofiac is doing is that it's a $150 million fund now that can invest, for instance, in buildings, and that they will take care of like looking at what can be done in terms of reducing carbon in a financially viable way. They will manage the technical aspect, of course, in collaboration with the building owner, for instance, and they will make sure that they will get paid actually by the energy savings over a 15-year period. So what's different from what we've seen in the past is that I like to call it, they don't necessarily call it that way, but I like to call it like patient capital. So it means that they do realize that in order to achieve carbon neutrality, or in order to respect our engagement to reduce the climate change to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, what we need is not just to change a light bulb, we need deep retrofit. And deep retrofit cannot be paid back in a year or two, but they can be paid back in 15 years, which is long, but which is not long for if you compare it to the life of the building. So that's we see that Sofiac now is on and is ready to invest, but there are other organizations also that are working on trying to get capital in the market that is more linked to what we need to do in order to reach carbon neutrality.
Yeah, I think Toronto Atmospheric Fund is also probably a good example of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
And then, Geneviève, I guess the second part of my question, it was such a long question, you probably forgot the second part. The second part was just about, is it easier for an organization with more capital really to get to carbon neutrality? Because of course they can do things like buy more carbon offsets and obviously and they can have the capital to make deeper investments. Is that necessarily true or not?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because when you buy carbon offset, it's not coming from your capital budget. So the way I see capital is when you really invest in an asset, right? And as opposed to like operating expenses. So when I talk about the different pillars, like when you talk about, for instance, asset management, it's really like it's linked to capital. So it means I'm gonna build a new building. I will deliberately invest 4% more in order for it to be really energy efficient or carbon neutral. So in that sense, that easier. If you have access to capital, whether it's your own capital, another capital, yeah, it's going to be easier to plan right ahead the energy management. But when I also talk, Olivier, about things like energy management, which is ISO 50001, which is basically something that does not require capital and it has fast payback. So I would say that the different pillars will require different type of investment. It's not always capital. The one thing I wanted to say just a second, Olivier, is that when we work with or we give seminar carbon neutrality, the one thing I always say is that your best shot right now to decrease your GHG emission is to invest in energy efficiency, and that might be understood by the participant in this webinar. That's a no-brainer. That's the thing we should be doing. But when I talk about carbon neutrality with the organization, they always come with, well, let's buy renewable natural gas, let's go with PPA to purchase green electricity, or let's buy carbon offset. And of course, those are part of what you need to do to reach carbon neutrality at some point. But it's really like we have to realize when we buy carbon offset, when we pay our electricity higher cost because it's carbon neutral, or the same for renewable natural gas, there is no payback to it. It means that you'll pay extra cash to reduce your GHG emissions years after years after years after years. It's really going to hurt your operating expenses. And the one thing that's not well understood outside the energy efficiency sector is that if you invest, whether it's your own capital or it's another investor invested for you, but when you invest in energy efficiency, what you actually do is you improve, of course, your asset, but you also contribute to reducing your operating expense. So it means that you can slash your GHG emissions without hurting your operating expenses. And that's the one thing I believe it's not well understood from people that are outside the energy efficiency sector. And that's really a message that we should be strong about, like us in the sector, to really say, well, you know, becoming carbon neutral, there's a lot of different things to do, but let's not forget that energy efficiency is probably the one thing to do first, right? Before even thinking about buying offset or per purchase agreement or renewable natural gas.
That makes a lot of sense. You talked about some of those points before when you talked about how having organizations that are smaller and have less resources and less staff may have some challenges there. But based on your experience with the designing the carbon neutral strategies, what, in your estimation, are some of the let's say top 2 or 3 obstacles for organizations to get started?
Okay, so I've talked already about limited knowledge or limited capacity. So that's the one thing. I think a lot of new people are getting interested now in carbon neutrality, but without really understanding what it is. There's different definitions of it. They just don't know what it is. It's only the natural gas I burn. Is like the employees coming to the office, is it the business travel? So a lot to do is about like understanding what it is. It's a relatively new topic, carbon neutrality. There's not a lot of training on that. There's not a lot of like publication guides and so on and so forth. So that's one obstacle. That's one challenge the organization face, that is that there's not that much literature. In some areas, there's a lot, but it's not readily accessible. So that will be one challenge. The other challenge to me is that it's a bit related to the answer I just gave about carbon offset and PPA and like renewable natural gas, is that people are looking at simple ways of becoming carbon neutral, and they're not really thinking about the most cost-effective way of doing it. And to me, that's a threat in the sense that all organizations could become carbon neutral tomorrow if they would decide to buy carbon offset, right? It's easy. You buy carbon offset, you become carbon neutral, it's done, put it on our website, and our job is done. And what I'm scared about, and that's a challenge that we face, is that after 2 years, 3 or 4 years, who knows when the economic cycle will not be as positive as it is now. It's probably the first thing they will cut is that we'll stop buying carbon offset, and they're really not helping their company financial balance as well. So the biggest challenge, I would say number 1 or even 2, like whatever, the top 3, is that organizations are looking at simple ways of becoming carbon neutral, and simple ways is to buy green electricity or buy carbon offset. But really the one challenge that we have in our sector and that the organization have is to really try to think in the most holistic way and say, okay, those are my assets. Those are what I'm planning on spending in my assets. How can I leverage what I'm already planning to invest in my organization to spend a little bit more and slash my GHG emission? Is there like deep retrofit I can do in my buildings? There are like real energy efficiency projects I can do, because those are the measures that not only like reduce carbon, like I said, but also that makes organization more financially viable. And that's a challenge I see, Olivier, with small and large organizations. Most of them are looking for in a too simplistic way. Oh, let's put it that way.
Interesting, thank you. You talked about, this will be my last question, then we'll open it up to the floor. You talked before about how the financial viability of certain companies and organizations could be threatened if you gave the example of Amazon and others, if there is not certain organizations don't have a pathway to carbon neutrality or don't become carbon neutral. Are you thinking that the biggest threat for organizations will be from potential trading partners and clients of theirs, or do you think the greater threat for most organizations is governments, and governments specifically having policies around requiring some kind of pathway to carbon neutrality or carbon neutrality in order to access funding or certain programming? What do you think? Of course, it could probably be both at the same time, but what do you think is more of a short-term threat, and maybe which one is more a bit to mid and long term?
Okay, I'll try to keep it simple, Olivier. Yeah, very sophisticated question. I think from the government, Canadian government, right, in the Canadian context, I don't see, and I might be wrong, I don't see that any policies or programs like that would be a threat to organization. We don't have we're not a country that we regulate a lot, that we're very constrained about the way we do business. But there may be missing opportunities with the government. What we see, like I said, is that more and more stimulus are attached to having some sort of carbon neutral strategy, even if the stimulus has nothing to do with climate change. Public acceptance for project, we've seen a lot of different, in English I forgot, but the office that look at the environmental aspects of the large capital projects in Canada, for instance, a new mine or anything like that. You have to go through an environmental process, and they are asking now for carbon neutrality as well. So it's more a missed opportunity with the government rather than a threat. But the threat is really coming from employee attraction, and the threat is coming from your clients as well. So when I've talked about Amazon, those large companies, for instance, they've said, well, I forgot the year, but it's in 5 years, they want all their goods to be transported in a green way, with the green boats and green routes, what they call. So that will become a threat. The more and more organizations are looking at reducing their scope 3 emissions, upstream and downstream. So they will look at organizations that can provide raw material, for instance, or goods or services that are carbon neutral. So the biggest threat I see is about the public acceptance of project for organizations that need some public acceptance, employee attraction, but also clients that are organizations that want to reduce their GHG emissions, and they want to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, and that they will ask all of their suppliers to show that they're reducing also the GHG emissions. So I think the pressure will come from the private sector.
Interesting, thank you. Alison, is it possible to open up the lines for questions?
Thank you so much. That was an incredible amount of information in a very short amount of time. So maybe I'll just start by saying this was recorded. So please go, if there was something that you wanted to refer to, all of our past Discovery events are in the event section of our website. So this will be posted mid next week. So let's go to some of the questions that are in the question boxes right now. I'm actually going to start with one that was in the chat. So Mark had asked a question about life cycle analysis. So life cycle analysis is probably used throughout the process. What is your appreciation of the state-of-the-art approach to carbon calculations, so embodied and operational, and are there any issues with reliability? Hopefully I captured that question correctly. Does anything jump to mind for you? Either
yes, okay, there, and you know, like there's terminology around carbon is a bit confusing even for those who work every day. So there's in the building sector mainly they're using less Scope 1, 2, and 3, but more like operational carbon and embodied carbon. Operational carbon is mainly the carbon that is generated from burning like natural gas or oil on the buildings, if we want to keep it simple, right? So life cycle analysis with operational carbon is very easy to do. Any like energy efficiency engineer can do it. I build a efficient building or non-efficient building, and how much it's going to cost me to put one option to the other up the ground, and how much I'm going to spend on energy for the next 100 years, and what's the carbon attached to it, and that's pretty easy to do, right? It's not done often, but it's easy to do. When we talk about embodied carbon, which could be the Scope 3 emission, I think that was one of the question in the Q&A. So yes, embodied carbon is like a subset of Scope 3 emissions. If you want to do life cycle analysis, but it's not easy right now. There are protocols that is more and more protocol that comes, and the issue is that coming with standard protocols. So for instance, if you build a new building out of concrete or wood, which one has the less impact on the environment from a GHG perspective? It's not easy calculation. You have to rely on experts, and there are no easy standards that you can apply. So right now, there's only a niche of organizations that are doing that. Most of them are larger organizations that can afford consultants to look at it, but it's not standardized yet. So it's not something that's, well done, it's a bit more complicated. But the more and more the embodied carbon in the building sector is becoming something that everybody's looking at. I've seen numbers, I think at the conference last year, they would say that embodied carbon is about 75% of the carbon of a building over a life cycle. So those are numbers that are starting to pop out. It's probably something that us in the sector will have to figure ways of calculating that more easily.
All right, so the challenge exists.
I hope that captures the question.
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, if people want to have a discussion, okay, Mark just said great answer. So yeah, and I would just encourage, you know, if anybody else has questions or wants to talk about it further, to probably contact Geneviève and Olivier. Let's go to the question about, you know, I think you were talking about how many companies are using that approach. So there's a question in the question and answer box about the percentage of public companies that have carbon reduction targets right now. So do you have a sense of how many public companies have these carbon reduction targets?
No, I really don't. What I know is that about 2-3 weeks ago in the ESG world, like so environment and social and government standard, that's only a standard for the financing sector and large organization. They have announced that they will be setting up an office in Montreal to restart working declaration standards, ESG declaration standard for large organizations that will integrate Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So I'm not sure about the numbers now, the percentage of public companies, as I will assume it's fairly low, but it's gonna increase quite a bit in the next few years. because the financial sector is asking for it, and more are. For instance, there's Econoler Cambridge, which is a very large real estate owner all across Canada, and they've just announced last week that they now have a science-based target initiative target. So they're becoming carbon neutral, and everybody's expecting that a lot of real estate companies will follow their steps. So, so I would assume the number is fairly low now, but it's going to increase quite fast.
Yeah. I think some of the different bodies that have the different ESG frameworks, they have some numbers as well, at least how many people are following their particular frameworks. So that's a great answer. Thank you so much. So the next question is about the price that you quoted for the cost per ton. Does that cost of $200 to $300 per ton using on-site measures is it using on-site measures, or does it also include buying offsets or RECs?
It includes everything from asset management, energy efficiency, heat recovery, renewable energy on site, PPA, renewable natural gas, and carbon offsets. So that was for a range of measures for portfolio of buildings, right? So that included some offset, but I think 5% of the GHG reduction was carbon offset, is really the thing I was not able to reduce. If we try to break down that $200, and that's the number we got for 2 or 3 portfolio of buildings, it might be different, right? It's just like any rule of thumb number. But if you look at the first steps in the reducing GHG, when you look at, for instance, energy management, asset management, energy efficiency, we've seen measures that were like -$100, -$200 per ton. And when you look at the other end of the spectrum, we've seen measures that were as expensive as $1,000 per ton. So the $200,000 to $300,000 on average is the average of some measures that are negative in the cost, right? Like -100, -200, to measures that might be like $1,000 per ton at the other spectrum. And when you bundle everything together, you get that average. And the other number that's interesting is that for what we've done, we have estimated that you can achieve between 40 and 60% reduction and being cost neutral. It means that your net present value will be 0. So you're not getting wealthier, you're not spending any money, you're not making any money, but you can in a cost neutral way, get about slash your emissions, but about half, which to me was very glad to see that when we came with those numbers. Yeah, it's a very promising number. So it means that everybody there's no financial barrier to that. It means that you can do it. Yeah, and it's cost neutral, and you can reduce your GHG emissions by 50%. And it's mainly energy management and energy efficiency.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Geneviève. So we've got a few other questions in here. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them. So I do, like I said, I encourage you to contact either Geneviève or Olivier to ask your questions. So Theo was wondering about the patient capital term that you used. I love that term. So, and I think this is coming from a point of connecting with other companies that have used this approach. Is there a list of companies that have done this work that could maybe act as a guide or answer some questions for people? Do you know how some of the people that are on the call today could potentially get in touch with some of the companies that have used this approach?
I don't think there's a list that's done. Olivier mentioned TAF, that Toronto Atmospheric Fund, Air Efficiency Capital in Ontario also, that can finance project and get repaid by savings. I'm not sure though if they are willing to wait to sign 10 or 15 years contracts. So I'm not sure if they fall into that spectrum, but you need to check with them. So it's called Efficiency Capital. The one I know best is Sofiac. That's sofiac.ca, and they are willing to sign 15-year contracts. So it means that the payback of the measures can be very long. So it means that they're really looking at projects. They're not only willing, they're looking at signing contracts over 10 to 15 years, because what they're after is really like deep retrofit projects. But to my knowledge, there are no others. And if there are others, they're fairly small. There might be local, but I don't know anybody who has a list. We've worked on a list with Enercan a few years ago, and they were like good financing product, but they were relatively small. So they were willing to finance project up to $5,000 to $10,000, which is not really like the order of magnitude I'm talking about. So Efficiency Capital, I know they can invest like probably in the hundred thousands or even millions. And Sofiac, for instance, they can invest like 10 to 15 millions in a project. So So it's different scale.
Right. Okay, thank you. So I think we've got time for one last question. Hopefully this will be a quick one. If people had to walk away from this presentation with one message, I know we covered a lot, but what would that be for you? What do you want people to take away from this?
Okay, it's Efficiency Canada webinar, right? And the message will be around energy efficiency, because that's my sector of activity as well. So the one thing I would like everybody to not only remember, but be very vocal about it, because we need to, is that in a building environment anyway, it's possible to reduce the emissions by 40 to 60% in cost-neutral way. And the way to do it is going with energy efficiency. And if we can redirect the discussion, the carbon neutrality discussion around energy efficiency, instead of talking a lot about capture and storage, carbon capture and storage, and carbon offset, and so on and so forth, I will be very happy, because it's really the one way that we should all be looking at to reduce our GHG emissions. So it's really energy efficiency is one key element of reaching our climate goal. Do you like that message?
I do personally, and hopefully Alison does too. It always goes back to that pyramid of activities, whereby you start with things that are more easily accessible, and then as it gets more and more complicated, you have to get more and more efficient at doing it, and obviously more capital intensive as well. From my side, Alison, I just want to add, hopefully everybody's enjoyed the session. If you did want to spend more time with Geneviève and more time on these types of topics, I have to throw this in there that you'll see in the middle of the screen that there is a Becoming Carbon Neutral course on May 24th. I think there are 5 or 7 or 8 or so seats left in that course. So yeah, if this is down your alley and important for your organization, please join us.
Fabulous. Thank you both so much. This was incredibly rich with information. I'm probably going to go back and watch the recording again too. So thank you for joining us so much today. We really appreciate it. And have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Happy Friday.
Thank you. Happy Friday.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.